Ellie, hello, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good too. Thank you very much. We're thrilled to have you here. We're starting our films by asking our contributors to introduce themselves and to give us an overview of their work. So would you mind doing that, please?
Yeah, sure. So, hello. My name's Ellie. I'm Dr. Ellie Reed, and I'm currently employed in the English department at Nottingham Trent University. And my research looks at domestic women's magazines from the first half of the 20th century. Specifically, I guess, my recent PhD looks at domestic culture in Women's Weekly magazine between 1918 and 1958. So yeah, Women's Weekly is the kind of main area of my research so far.
Thank you. And would you mind unpacking the term domestic culture for us? I can see that's a really big question, but for anyone who's new to that phrase and that idea, would you mind telling us a bit more about that?
Yeah, okay. So I guess what I'll say is I'll tell you what it means in the kind of context of my research and what I've been working on. And I guess, I've been looking at the domestic identities that Women's Weekly, which is a domestic women's magazine, it started in 1911 and it's still going. So it's had a very long run indeed. So I'm looking at the kind of domestic identities that its readers, that it constructed for its readers from the end of the First World War until about 10 years after the end of the Second World War. And those domestic identities are quite interesting. They're not the magazine is not just about being a good housewife and a good mother, and things that you might things that you might usually sort of associate with domesticity. It also talks about working readers, for instance. It's very aware that a lot of its unmarried readers in particular have jobs. It was very normal in those days for women to leave school and then go into paid employment before they got married, which was obviously what was expected of them. And so it's sort of concerned with, in a way, kind of creating domestic identities for its working readers as well. It sort of assumes that they're only working to sort of earn money between leaving school and starting, getting married and starting families of their own. And it's kind of keeping them in that mindset, sort of in preparation for married life later on. So yeah, I guess it's sort of domesticity in many aspects of its readers' lives.
Thanks, Ellie. And if it's all right, again, just to play with a phrase you just used, that idea of keeping them in that mindset, keeping them within a kind of normative lifespan and kind of career trajectory from school to working to being married and presumably not working. Where does that sit in your work, and where does that sit in relation to the history of women's writing, reading, feminism, etc.? What do you do with that?
That's an enormous question. Oh my goodness. I guess
if it helps to unpack it a bit, I mean, the phrase "keeping them in that mindset" almost sounds a little bit like patriarchal propaganda, and I wonder if that is what it is, or if I'm misunderstanding that.
Yeah, okay, so it's very complicated. So I'm going to answer this question in relation to Women's Weekly rather than the entire history of women's writing and feminism. I think it is patriarchal. Well, for me anyway, it's patriarchal propaganda. I certainly would resist any, the idea that that my aim in life is to get married and have children. There are lots of other things I want to do. But for Women's Weekly readers at that time, they're in a culture that kind of assumes that women of their class will do that. They are buying into the magazine because they're buying the magazine. No one's forcing them to buy it and read it. But also, I think it's really important to remember that for the women targeted by the magazine, marriage was actually a very good option, because a lot of the jobs that they would have been doing wouldn't have been particularly interesting. They wouldn't have been very well paid at all. The magazine assumes that they'd be in fairly kind of mundane, pedestrian clerical work, for instance. So for which they wouldn't have been very well paid. And so actually for them, meeting a man and getting married and you know, having the sort of the relative autonomy of having your own home and running that home and having your children, bringing them up, looking after your family, would actually have been a better option for, you know, than staying in a job with very few prospects for the rest of their lives. So it's difficult. Yes, on the one hand, like from a feminist perspective, or from some feminist perspectives, because feminism is a very broad church, you know, so from you can say that it is a tool of patriarchal oppression, but it's kind of complicated because you have to kind of look at it within the context of its readers' lives, and you know what their aspirations were.
Yeah, thank you. Do you mind giving me the dates again of the magazine?
Yeah, so Women's Weekly itself was launched in 1911, and it's still going. In 2011, it celebrated its centenary by inviting its readers to knit bunting triangles, and they broke the Guinness World Record for the length of knitted bunting, which was pretty cool.
Wow.
But anyway, and the magazine, I think I said, yeah, the magazine is still going, but I'm interested in it between sort of 1918, so the end of the First World War, and then 1958, so just before second wave feminism really gets going.
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in those early dates because I mean, I think of the kind of post-war period as a period in which there's a demographic shortfall and an increase in single women, and a decrease in men. So it becomes a particularly interesting historical moment in which to be assuming that the proper life is lived from a brief early period of work followed by a period of marriage.
Yeah, absolutely, and actually the magazine acknowledges that.
Right.
At the end of the First World War, it has a regular column called Chats on Careers, which is targeting job seekers. So that could be readers who are unmarried, it could be readers' daughters, of course, or even their granddaughters, but it also could include women whose husbands have sadly been killed, or they've been disabled in some way, and they're now responsible for becoming kind of economic providers for their families and for supporting themselves and their children, and possibly even their husbands as well. So it's very interesting to sort of see the kind of jobs that they describe in this column, and you can tell things like, you know, becoming a boarding house landlady, for instance, or perhaps opening a tea shop. These are jobs that married women could do.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, you've given us a really great sense of this magazine and its investment in exploring domestic culture, domestic identity. Do you mind telling us a bit more about what your work then does with that material? Are you looking for historical changes across the period that you're looking at? Are you looking for different kinds of readers, different kinds of writing, different kinds of image making within the magazine? What kind of things are you doing with your work?
Okay, so there's kind of two main things that I'm trying to do. So the first thing is looking at its kind of social, cultural context. I guess the kind of my big argument is that Women's Weekly was targeting a very specifically lower middle class readership. And by lower middle class, I kind of understand a reader who is probably working class in origin, or at least she comes from, I mean, I don't really want to be too specific, but she will come from a, you know, a fairly kind of modest background, but she definitely views herself as middle class, and she sort of aspires towards leading a middle class lifestyle, and the magazine is helping her to do that. And so I'm sort of I look at the magazine in 10-year intervals, and also throughout the Second World War, and I look at how the magazine constructs a specifically lower middle class identity for its readers at those times, and then I use that to look at how this identity might change over time in relation to what else is going on in the world and within the context in which the magazine is being produced. So there is that, but I'm approaching the magazine as a work of literature as well. So I look at it within kind of literary context. I look at it alongside novels which were published at the same time, and I kind of compare what it's saying to, you know, what those novels are saying, for instance. but I'm also very interested in the kind of the text of the magazine itself, and I use, I guess, a really important part of my kind of specifically literary approach is to kind of close read the magazine, close read not just the words, but also, as you say, the images, which provide these, you know, which really kind of expand the meanings of the words, and also, you know, the layout of the magazine, and even sometimes looking at its font, and the way that, you know, the each individual column is kind of displayed on the page, what it appears next to, whereabouts in the magazine it appears, that kind of thing. So I'm looking at the magazine itself as a literary text within literary contexts.
I love all that. Thank you. It's really exciting, and you're making us think now about the kind of architecture of the page with the layout. And again, I should think for lots of viewers, it might be new to think about font, but font and the various associations of different kinds of choices of font, their readability and potentially their ideology, I think can be really fascinating. So I work in the 16th century, and so thinking about Roman font and italic font in the 16th century context in which England is defining itself as Protestant against a Catholic Rome, suddenly the very idea of italics and of Roman font, you can see why the English might be getting anxious about that idea. Are there comparable ways of thinking about fonts in the early 20th century, or particular things which font is doing?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I mean, again, I've only really thought about this in relation to Women's Weekly so far, so I don't really want to talk about that any more broadly. But for instance, I have some copies of Women's Weekly here. I don't know, I'm just going to sort of hold this one up. You can see that, you know, the font is quite austere. It's quite upright. It's very respectable looking, and that kind of sort of quite conservative, very respectable appearance is, I mean, that's something that the magazine was very much trying to cultivate in its readers, sort of something very respectable. So it kind of does reflect the magazine's kind of character, if that helps. Yeah,
absolutely. May we see that again?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also fascinated by colour, and then against the font you've got that kind of diagonal swish of clothing and the diagonal head turn from the model. And then the thing I'm most interested in, because I am basically a boring words person, is the fact that right to the top it just says in capital letters, "Armour Against Love." So I don't know what that's saying about the magazine's relationship with the erotic. The erotic, something you have to defend yourself from. Is there wordplay between armour and amour? I've got no idea. But
I think there definitely is. I mean, to give you a little bit more context, this magazine was issued on February the 10th, 1945. So it's towards the end of the Second World War, but the war is still, you know, very much happening. There are kind of, there is another that I've looked at recently. I've looked at another romance story in Women's Weekly called Secret Armour, which puns secret amour, and it's the idea that a woman's love keeps a man safe from harm on the battlefield, and that providing that he's confident in her love, he will be a good, he will not be distracted from fighting, and he will serve his country well and come back a hero to her. And so there are that pun armour amour. It's kind of it's like a protection. It's a way of protecting your man when he's fighting for his country. I have to confess to have not read Armour Against Love yet, so I couldn't.
We'll do a sequel. Yeah, we
can do a sequel, and I can tell you what it's about. But yeah.
I mean, it sounds worried about sexuality. It would be my those 3 words.
Yeah, it was. So during the war, the magazine becomes, you know, terrified about how its readers are behaving, and so I guess for context, so quite close to the beginning of this, at the beginning of the Second World War, women's magazine editors, not all of them, but a lot of them, kind of volunteered their magazines to the government and said, we will disseminate, you know, they've got these mass readerships, they're reaching lots of homes, lots of women. They offered to kind of disseminate propaganda amongst their readers. And so they were, you know, the government throughout the war were using them as this kind of essentially as a propaganda tool, and their contents really reflect that. I've completely lost my thread. What was I saying?
You were telling us about the reach and the kinds of content and where the kinds of stories that the magazine was trying to tell during the war.
Oh yeah, and reader sexuality. Yes, and so in sort of from 1943, particularly from 1943 when the Americans entered the war, there was a lot of concern about British women's sexual conduct while their husbands were away fighting. You know, what they might be getting up to in their absence, and you know, particularly with the Americans coming over with these kind of very attractive, well-paid, well-dressed men who, you know, culturally might have been a bit more kind of outgoing than British men. There was a lot of concern that they were kind of leading British women astray, and so the magazine was very keen to stop this from happening. And so the magazine kind of publishes, well, firstly on behalf of the government, the magazine publishes these kind of directives from the Ministry of Health, warning its readers about venereal disease and how you can catch it and what the consequences are, which for Women's Weekly was huge, because up until then it just didn't mention sex at all, or when it did, it referred to it in incredibly kind of closed sort of euphemistic terms. So it was sort of virtually impossible to know what it was talking about unless you already knew. So for the magazine to be talking about venereal disease and gonorrhea and syphilis and things, like, putting it out there is, you know, really quite big. But the magazine's romance stories also kind of echo this, echo these messages. And so, you know, there were lots of stories where, you know, the heroine will, you know, her boyfriend or her husband will be out fighting in somewhere other than Britain, and, you know, while she's on her own, she'll kind of meet a very handsome, charming serviceman who will woo her, and she will be tempted, but, you know, she will then decide that actually she's going to remain faithful to her boyfriend who's overseas. And it's sort of, you know, a way of persuading readers that this is the conduct, you know, this is the conduct that's expected of them, and this is what they should be doing.
That's fascinating in terms of the way it makes you think about the relationship between what you're describing as government propaganda and health warnings and maybe think pieces, and then fictional literature, and how the two are playing similar games, I suppose. And here we are in our own moment of cultural crisis, and it'd be interesting to think about the ways in which some of the stories that our own culture is engaging with right now, some of the fictional stories might be asking us to think about, I don't know, social distancing, for example, isolation, etc. But yes, do we know much about the writers writing the fictional stories here, and how, you know, how do these fictional stories, which are so in dialogue with the advice the government would like to get out there, how do these writers end up channeling such similar and pertinent stories? Do we know?
No, sadly, the Women's Weekly archive never kept any record of its kind of writers and producers, which is a real shame, because we know very little about how it kind of interacted with them. Given the kind of blatantness of the propaganda in the wartime stories, I'm pretty sure that, you know, writers were being instructed to write those, to include those themes in their stories. But it's not new in the magazine. This is a tool that the magazine's been using for years. You know, this idea that the romance fiction, in a way, kind of makes desirable the kind of attitudes and values within the broader magazine. So, for instance, you know, this idea that the magazine has this very strong expectation that its readers, you know, those of its readers who are single, will, you know, they're working in paid employment at the moment, but eventually they will meet a man, they'll get married, they'll leave work, and they'll settle down and have children. and they'll be housewives and mothers, and that's their kind of ultimate career, if you like. And the magazine's romance stories reflect this. Throughout the interwar period, there were lots of kind of workplace romance stories about a heroine who works as a typist, or as a shop girl, or as a lady's companion, or a governess or something. And, you know, she meets a man, falls in love, and is absolutely delighted to give up work. And she can't wait to stop work and have a home of her own. And so it's kind of pushing this idea, this very romantic idea that, you know, that as a woman, your ultimate career, if you like, is full-time housewifery and motherhood. And by presenting that as the kind of happy ending of a romance story, this kind of makes it desirable to the readers, or it tries to anyway.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I'm just thinking about how often I'm seeing people talking at the moment about programs like Schitt's Creek or The Good Place, which are themselves about people who lose their previous lives and get shoved into a small confined space with people that they don't really want to be with. And again, that sense of whether that's speaking to our own moment. Do we know much about the I want to say users, the target readership of the magazine? Do we know much about how the magazine would have been used, read, who would have bought it, etc.?
I've been able to pick up a lot from the magazine itself, and I've heard and read anecdotal things, but I've not personally interviewed any women from that time who bought and read the magazine. So I'm actually very, very careful in my work to draw that distinction between the reader as she was and the reader targeted by the magazine, or the reader constructed by the magazine. And I'm very clear that that's who I'm writing about, because obviously it could have been bought by anybody. And actually we know that it was, I mean, it was even read by men. The men write to the agony aunt, Mrs. Marriott. So, you know, it's likely that the magazine had more diverse readership than you might think by looking at its contents. But I mean, I don't know anything about, you know, I haven't been able to discover anything about the readers sort of personally, but I mean, the readers targeted by the magazine are definitely kind of, I would say, housewives on fairly low incomes who can't afford to employ paid domestic help. Certainly before the Second World War, they can't afford to buy expensive domestic appliances like vacuum cleaners or refrigerators. And if they're married, they're assumed not to have paid jobs, but if they're unmarried, they're assumed to be working probably in a clerical job, such as a typist or a telephonist.
And yet they're also assumed to have time to read the magazine.
Yes, I know. Well, that's the thing. The magazine, it's all short. It's made up of little short sections, and it's very pick up and put downable. Yeah, so you can I don't know, you can read a column about dressmaking while you're waiting for the kettle to boil. Yeah. Right.
Okay, that's fascinating, because again, this demographic has implications for format and presumably for price of the magazine.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So throughout the interwar years, it cost, I think, about between 2.2 and 2.5. And by the time of the war, it's sort of, during the war, it goes up to 3.3 to kind of, materials were becoming a lot more expensive, so they needed to increase the cost of the magazine. But yeah, compared to other magazines, it's not quite as cheap as the really cheap magazines such as Peg's Paper and My Weekly, but it's definitely cheaper than the kind of Good Housekeeping, for instance, which was a glossy domestic monthly magazine which cost about £1. So yeah, it's kind of in the kind of lower middle bracket of the magazine market in terms of price.
Thanks, Ellie. And do we know the demographic of the people behind the magazine? Do we know who's editing, writing? Oh, you said we didn't know much about who writes for the magazine, but do we know anything at all about the personnel?
Again, without the magazine archive, it's very, very difficult to find anything out. And so far, the focus of my research has not been on the people, on its producers. But that is definitely fascinating, and I'd love to find out more. And my sense is that they're probably, whatever their background is, they're probably better educated than the women targeted by the magazine, which sort of raises interesting questions about, you know, the values and the attitudes of the magazine's producers in their own personal lives versus the ones that they're kind of promoting in the magazine. So, for instance, any kind of women working on the magazine, any female journalists, for instance, or any editors, may well have taken a decision not to get married and have children because they wanted to focus on their careers instead, and yet they're kind of persuading this entire reader demographic that, you know, that their place is essentially in the home. And like, kind of, where does that sit with their personal, you know, their personal values? And yeah, so there's a kind of there's a very interesting tension there, I think, between the class, or, you know, the demographic that's producing the magazine, the demographic that's reading it. And I would definitely like to look into that further at some point. But as I say, I have not been able to do that so far. So yeah, that's something for the future.
Okay, great. But as you the way you see your work is a kind of two-pronged question about where the magazine sits in a wider social and cultural context, attaching particularly to this class and gender demographic on the one hand, but then also how the magazine functions, presumably for that readership, or for you, I'm not sure, as literature, and how we might close read not just text but image and layout. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit more about how those two things come together? That's again a really big question. I'm sorry.
It's about the kind of about how the magazine sort of functions as literature within the literary field. So I guess one of the things I'm interested in about that is kind of how it kind of writes back against sort of how can you can use it to read back against sort of other literature that was produced at the same time. So for instance, a lot of novels at the time were quite disparaging about people from the lower middle classes and lower middle class culture. And you get a lot of very negative representations of that demographic and their lifestyles in books by, I guess, George Orwell, J.B. Priestley, people like that. And so to kind of see this, to read this magazine against that, and to read Woman's Weekly showing this very kind of proudly lower middle class, sort of creating a very proudly lower middle class lifestyle for its readers. And actually, you know, some of the kind of characteristics of you recognize some of the sort of characteristics of lower middle class culture in writing by people like Orwell and Priestley. You kind of recognize those characteristics in Woman's Weekly, but whereas in the novels they're quite negative and they're things to be sneered about, in the magazine they're things that you want to be proud about and things that you want to cultivate. So that's really, really fascinating. And also I'm really fascinated by the magazine's treatment of typists, who again get quite bad press in other literature of the day. So, you know, you think about there's the typist in T.S. Eliot, in The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, who's kind of this very slatternly woman. She lives in a very kind of mucky flat, and she has this kind of really awful, not terribly satisfying sexual experience with a clerk who's a bit, you know, he's not terribly attractive, and it's just not very nice. But in Woman's Weekly, you know, Woman's Weekly fiction, the typists are always beautiful, they're well dressed, they live in beautifully kept rooms that they're decorating with, using their own crafting skills. They have like wonderful relationships with men that they meet at work, and you know, it's all lovely, and it's a very kind of positive representation of the typist that you don't sort of necessarily get in fiction of the time. So I love, what I really love about it is, you know, that you can kind of take these kind of negative representations of women within kind of what I imagine Women's Weekly's target demographic would have been. You can take those negative representations from these kind of novels that were being published at the time, and then you can look at the same figures within the magazine and the same ideas within the magazine and see it completely the other way around. And I think that's really wonderful and really affirmative.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's something there as well about women in text, both on behalf of the people reading the magazine, but perhaps also the people producing words for the magazine, because you wouldn't have to go far back that many decades historically, and this class and gender demographic wouldn't have been trained to read. So there's something here about the celebration of female lower middle class literacy.
Definitely. Yeah.
And I wonder too if some of the work you're doing is contemporary to the explosion in women as readers and writers of murder mysteries, which again, I think of typists as kind of a key character of a lot of murder mysteries in bureaus, in the spaces in which murder happens, etc. Maybe there are some stories to be told there, I don't know. Ellie, we're moving towards the end of our film now, and towards our kind of a final question, which is about literature and where the word literature sits for you, either personally or professionally. And you're welcome to answer this from the perspective of Women's Weekly, if you'd like to. But what does the word literature mean to you? What value does it have in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think literature for me just means anything that you can read, and that could be anything. So I don't know, it could be, you can kind of, you could read a magazine, you can read, I mean, obviously, what I'm trying to say is I think that goes beyond text, goes beyond written text. Like, I could provide a close reading of, like, my fountain pen, for instance, which is like here, or like the small succulent plant which is on my windowsill. I could, like, that for me, if I wanted to close read that, is a text, and so that could be literature. And that probably sounds a bit pretentious, but I kind of, that's how I feel. Yeah, anything you can read is literature.
I would rather read your small succulent plant on your windowsill over so many things that I find I have to read in my job sometimes. That sounds great.
Yes, exactly.
Ellie, it's been a real pleasure. I've learned tons. Thinking about the early 20th century, thinking about a demographic then which I don't think we do represent very well now in the way we think about literary culture, reading culture, domestic culture. I've really enjoyed thinking about both the social and cultural context on the one hand, and the place of the magazine in a field of literature, however we understand that term, on the other. I'm going to shout the phrase "Armour Against Love" wherever I go for the rest of the evening, and just see how that works out for me. And I also like the idea of the magazine writing back to contemporary literature. So being in a position of contestation, being in competition over representations of human identity, I think that's really, really exciting. I'm just summarising that partly for the benefit of the viewers, but also in case there's anything there I've misunderstood or you want to add to. Did you have anything else you wanted to say?
I don't think so at all. No, that all sounds fine.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I agree. More than fine. Really, really exciting. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for talking to me.
Cheers.